Hello everyone and welcome to this After Effects scripting tutorial for beginners 2022. Now every year some things update in the scripting environment, so I'm going to make this updated video because my previous one was made about 7 years ago and the resources and tutorial content isn't exactly the same as would be applicable today. So today I'm going to be showing you what scripting is for After Effects, what you can do with it. We're going to be making a simple interface which has some basic functionality and different UI elements to get you started scripting, and then to show you all the resources and things if you want to learn more on your own or get access to all the learning materials. Before we get started with this video, I do want to remind you down below, hit subscribe and the bell icon to be notified of new videos coming out twice weekly on the channel. And down in the description, you can check out the code for this script, try it out for yourself, and read all the details inside of it in the GitHub link. Follow us there for coding updates, and in the description, follow us on Instagram for other live updates. If you're not already a member of our Discord server, you can come and join to get help with scripting, extensions, plugins, expressions, submit tutorial ideas, hang out with a lot of our awesome members, and a lot more. And if you'd like to help support us on YouTube financially and get cool perks like Discord status, lots of these cool emojis, code in advance, live streams, you can become a member, supporter, premium supporter, or VIP. Link for that is in the description. You can also check out the link below for Adobe Exchange, as well as AE Scripts to help support us there and check out some cool products. So what is scripting? You've probably heard of it, and if you're a complete beginner, this is going to be basically applicable to you. Scripting is something that allows you to automate tasks that would normally take a long time or that you would do by hand repetitively. For example, if you had to double click on something, import some footage, and do that 500 times, that would get very old or take a lot of your time. With scripting, you could automate such a simple task as that to do it in just a few seconds and do it in one click of a button. There's also many other time-saving things, and you can tie it all together with an interface like this, which allows you to input files, input text, use sliders, and connect all sorts of values using programming, basically. If you don't know any programming, this tutorial will still be applicable for you, but it will be a bit of a learning curve to familiarize yourself with the formatting and the way things appear. So like I said, you can run repetitive operations as many times as you want instantly. Everything from importing files, to rendering, to adding effects, to adjusting things, adding keyframes, expressions. You can adjust any of the properties, compositions, layers, effects, expressions, keyframes, and oftentimes things like menu items with the scripting API. Now, how do you actually write scripts? Well, technically you can write a script in Notepad or text edit if you wanted to, but there are some programs that are specifically made for scripting which make things easier and help you out a lot. The first one is called Adobe Extend Script, which no longer is compatible with Macs because it is a 32-bit application and those have been totally tossed out by the newest Mac OSs. Extend Script is still working on older versions of Mac and most versions of Windows now. You can download it from this link here, and you can also download it from the Creative Cloud app as well if you enable like the older applications. Some of the reasons you'd want to use ExtendScript is it allows you to directly interface and connect to your program. So you could say connect to After Effects and run your script instantly without having to go in here and go to like File, Scripts, Run Script File, choose your file, come in here, find the bugs, save it, re-go to that. It's a nice and fast way to connect to any program and run your script. And it also has something called the Object Model Viewer, which contains a whole list of all the different programs it can connect to, all the different types of code and UI types you can create. This may be a little bit advanced, but it basically contains all of the learning material you would need. Now again, the disadvantages are it's becoming obsolete because it's not supported by newer OSs, especially on the Mac side of things, and it's just not really up to date. This was made a long time ago, and there's not any extensions to it. There's not a whole lot of control of the UI and color, and that leads us to the next option, which is Visual Studio Code. And that is what most people use nowadays because there are extensions that people have made to make it much more user-friendly to be able to develop and run scripts. So Visual Studio Code is the most common nowadays, and there are two extensions that I would recommend using. ExtendScript Debugger by Adobe. This is sort of the base extension you'll need, and this is this one right here. It basically gives you full support to actually write scripts and then connect them to programs, debug, and things like that, all within ExtendScript, and all of that is right within Visual Studio Code. The only things it doesn't support are things like the Object Model Viewer, which I discussed about extend script here, which is something that's quite useful and reveals some parts of the scripting guide that aren't revealed in the available internet guides. And it's also missing a couple things like functions and autocomplete, profile and support. But for the most part, this is totally fine to use now as an actual script writer. The other thing I'd recommend using is Adobe Script Runner by RenderTom. This requires that you have that Extend Script Debugger extension installed, but this will basically allow you to have a script ready, hit F1, and then choose, say, Adobe After Effects or whatever program you want to launch it in immediately. If you use the Extend Script Debugger, you have to set up a debug file and other things, which basically allows you to do things like breakpoints. And these two extensions are the main ones you're going to want to use, primarily Adobe Script Runner if you want to run things fast. So in today's video, I'll be using Adobe Script Runner, but again, you also will need this other extension installed in order to have that scripting support. Once you have gotten past that step and have chosen an editor, we need to load up a guide. So the first guide is the link here that will take us to AE-scripting. So the first guide here is the AE scripting guide itself. In the object model viewer of Extend Script, there is no AE reference. All of the AE scripting reference you'll ever want is in this document here. If you want to convert it to a PDF instead of an HTML format, you can do that as well. And this is basically everything you'll ever need to know. It has all the different types of items, from the application to the project, to the compositions, to the layers, to the effects, to the properties, to the keyframes. Everything you'd ever need to know is in this guide here, and you'll definitely want to become familiar with it, comfortable typing in different things in the search bar to quickly find functions, or to see what properties do I need to add a composition, and much more. The other scripting guide I would like to reference is the UI scripting guide, which goes over a lot of the UI customization and base elements, event listeners, and all of that. You can see it references the object model viewer quite a bit because that is also where you have a lot of UI things referenced. It basically tells you all the different things inside of, for example, a button. You can check indent of a button, the justification, the minimum size, the text inside of it, the size. So this is just basically to define and show you all the different types of things, how to make each of the possible UI elements for a script. And we're going to be making, of course, our own script UI in this tutorial momentarily. So let's go ahead and get started with the scripting part itself. We're going to write our first bit of code, and we're going to make a new script from scratch here in Visual Studio. We're going to start by creating the interface of our script, which, if we take a look at again here, has some sample text, 2 sample buttons, drop down, a panel with a radio and a checkbox, and a slider. These are going to actually have functionality in a bit, but for now we're going to learn about the user interface, or the UI, and the 2 different kinds. So there are floating and dockable type UIs. The floating kinds are just like this. They float around. We can't put them within the different windows here in After Effects, but if you do have a dockable script, they will appear here under Window. And for example, I could say this advanced color scheme script, I can dock this, resize it, and put it inside of my After Effects panel itself. So there's floating, which basically sit on top of everything, and dockable, which stick into the UI just like this. So you have those 2 options. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just going to be doing a floating script to keep it basic, and I do have other tutorials on the channel about creating other interfaces as well. So I'm going to start by creating a new file in Visual Studio Code, and this is going to be my script. For now, it's not actually recognizing that this is a JSX file, and I should mention that that is the format we are going to be using. So I'm just going to call this tutorial.jsx. And as soon as I call it JSX, it's going to bring up this little icon here. This is actually the React icon for React.js, because React.js uses JSX files as well. This is just an earlier example or use of JSX. So the first thing we want to do when creating an interface is create a window. Anytime in programming, when you want to store something, you can store anything in a variable. This could mathematically be represented by X, Y, Z, anything, except we can use words and, for example, window. That's a word meaning window in English. We're going to set our variable window. We're going to create basically a placeholder called window and store something in it. To create a new window itself, we're going to say new window, and that has to be capitalized. And then in these parentheses, we're going to add arguments which define properties of our window, Like what kind of window is it? Is it a palette window, a floating window? Does it have a certain name we want to give it? So the first argument we're just going to give it is palette. This defines it basically as a floating window. Then we're going to give it a name. We'll just say my window. And then the third argument is required. We're going to separate our arguments by commas. And I'm just kind of breezing through basic programming terminology here for the beginners, but basically just try and follow along. You want to separate each of these arguments with a comma. This one defines what kind of window we want, the name of the window, and this third one defines basically what the size properties. If we say undefined, it's going to figure it out for us. Then if we want to show our window, we just grab window.show, and we might get some autocorrect, window.show, and this should show it on our screen. What I also want to do is say window.center, autocorrect again, and if we had a different variable name like my window, we would just need to update this to make sure that it is referring to this window. So let's go ahead and run this. What we're going to do is hit F1 because I am using RenderTom's Adobe Script Runner, and I'm going to say Adobe After Effects, and this will load my window in After Effects. You can see it's tiny, but that's because we haven't loaded anything. So let's go ahead and first set the orientation of our window. The orientation basically means which way are the elements going to go. Are the elements going to go from top to bottom, or are the elements going to go from left to right? The way we set that is grabbing our window element, and we say dot orientation. We're changing the orientation property, and we're going to set it to be a string, which is basically just some text within quotation marks, and we're going to say column. That's going to mean all the elements within our window go from top to bottom. You can see it's crossing this out. This is thinking that it's basically not doing anything, but it thinks that it's a React, not a JavaScript sort of Adobe script. And just ignore this. This will still be applied, and we'll change it to a column. Now let's add some static text, is what it's called, just to have some basic text in our window. I'm going to say var text, and we're going to set this placeholder variable named text to equal some new text. But instead of saying like new text like this, like we did with the window, we're simply going to add a property to our window. What that means is we're going to say my window, and we're going to add something. Not an event listener, we're just going to add something. This is going to take 3 arguments. The first is what are we going to add? If you wanted to add a button, you could say button. If you want to add, in this case, some static text, we're going to add static text. The second argument is undefined. Just like up here on the window, we don't want to define our sizes or our bounds of our element here. We want the script to automatically decide those to basically match whatever our text ends up being. And the third argument is a string with the text we want our text to say. So we can just say, this is my text. Now if we save this, hit F1, and run it in After Effects, you can see now we have my window, and this is my text. If I would simply duplicate this and create 2 versions, despite the variable names being the same, we can make them different. And we run this, you can see now we have 2 texts, and they're going from top to bottom, which is why we set the column orientation. If we set our orientation to be row, then they would then go from left to right along our window. Alright, so next up, I want to create a group with 2 buttons. I want to make sure the column is set for my window, so everything goes from top to bottom. The text will be a child of the window, and I want to now create a group. A group is something we can put multiple UI elements in, and basically have a column or row within a column setup. So if I just say group is equal to my window, we're going to add a group, undefined size, and the name of the group doesn't matter, we can just leave it blank. Then we're going to say group.orientation. Despite the group being inside the window, it can also have its own orientation, which I'll set to a row. Then let's create 2 buttons. I'm going to say button1 is a variable equal to my group.add. I'm going to add a button to my group. Instead of adding it to our main window, our group is already in our main window, we're going to add our button inside of the group. So we'll say button undefined size, and just say button1. And then I can copy and paste this line of code. Call this one button2, change the text. Now let's see how that looks. So now you can see, if we compare the code to the actual appearance here, we have a column set orientation for the window. the text is the first thing. Then we have a group which goes from left to right, and all the elements in that group are buttons. So you can see there, if we change this to a column, everything in our UI would continue to go straight down, just like that. So we'll keep the group orientation at row, and now let's add a couple more elements. Let's add what's called a drop-down list. So we'll just say drop-down, and we're going to add this to our window, say mywindow.add, and the text for it is drop-down list, one word, all lowercase, and we'll say undefined for the size, and for this argument we need to provide an array. An array is basically a bunch of values, so we can say array is equal to these brackets here, and we can basically say test1, test2, test3, and each of these elements are separated by a comma, similar to our arguments in here, and we can fill this in as our dropdown. So you can see here, when we click on the dropdown, we have test1, test2, and test3, because a dropdown list requires an array of elements, or an array of names in this case. If we want to set the selection of it, because by default it's just blank, we can say dropdown.selection is equal to 0, which means it will effectively select the first element of the array. In programming, when you refer to an array, if you wanted to grab a specific item inside the array, in this case, if we said array 0, this grabs the first one. In programming, for some reason or another, these all start with 0 in arrays. So if you wanted to grab the first element, it's element 0. If you want to grab test2, the second element, it's number 1 as an index is called. And if you want to grab test3, it's index 2. So that's why we say selection is equal to 0, so we can select the very first element here. Now when we run it, you can see we have our dropdown, which is too small. So let's adjust the size of our element. This is how you can change the size of any of these UI elements. First, you call the variable and say .size, and we're going to set the size equal to an array. This array needs only 2 values. As you can see, this one here has 3 values. This array needs 2, an X size and a Y size, or a width and a height. So I can say maybe 120, it assumes pixels, 120 pixels by 25, and run this. As you can see, it's a bit longer. Maybe we could make it even longer and call that good, like 180, and run that. So now we have a nice long drop down, and it's selecting our elements appropriately. Let's create a couple more elements before we program some actual functionality of this script. So aside from this group type, there's also a panel type, which is basically a group with an outline and also an optional name. So I'll copy and paste this group text, and we'll call it panel. And I'll change the add from group to panel, and we can just call the text my panel. Now if I run this, you can see we have an empty little box here with my panel as some text. Let's add a radio button and a checkbox to this. So let's create a radio button. We'll say radio is equal to, we're going to add it inside of my boxed panel here, panel.add radio button, undefined size, and we'll just call it radio. Then we'll add a checkbox. We'll just call checkbox is equal to our panel.add. We're going to add something called a checkbox, all lowercase, undefined size, and the text will say checkbox. Now I'll go ahead and run this. You can see right off the bat, we have a panel with a name and our checkbox and our radio box. Let's go ahead and set the orientation to be row so they don't go from top to bottom. We can say panel.orientation is equal to row and run this. And now they go from left to right. So we have created most of the types of elements. There's 2 more I kind of want to go over, and one of them I forgot in the example, which is an edit text box. This is something that allows you to input text. So we can say text box is equal to my window. We're going to add called edit text, undefined size, and this will be the text inside of the box, my input. Let's go ahead and run this. You can see now we have a text box that says my input, and this will allow you to input text and get it from your user. Now lastly, let's add a slider. I'll just say var slider, Again, remember all these variable names are arbitrary. You can call them whatever you want, a letter, a name. These are just to store the actual elements of the UI, which we can later change the values of and things like that. So to create a slider, we'll say my window dot add, and the keyword here is slider, say undefined, and we don't want any text with our slider. We can go ahead and run this, and now we have a slider, which if we ever wanted to get the value of, we could easily do so. So this is how we can create a basic UI. Again, this is a floating UI, and these are the basic types of elements you want to create: text, buttons, drop-downs, radio and checkboxes, text inputs and sliders. And there's not really a whole lot of room for custom UI elements in scripting. It's all based on this previously defined set of things, and you can actually use images as well, which is slightly more advanced. One other quick trick I wanted to show is how to add an item manually to this dropdown. So we already have 3 items, which I created with this array here. If I wanted to later add something, I could just call my dropdown and say .add. And there's 2 arguments for adding things to a dropdown. The first is what we want to add. We want to add what's called an item, and then we want the text of the item. So we could say my extra item, and now we have this 4th item that says my extra item. That's just a way you can do that if you want to start manipulating these elements and adding extra things to them. All right, next we're going to basically initialize some actual automation with these buttons that we've created. We have button 1 and button 2. First, we need to learn how we can basically detect when they're triggered. When someone clicks on the button, how do we know? So what we do to check is we grab the name of the variable for the button, in this case button 1, and we say dot on click. This is basically an automatic detection of whenever they click on the button. And what we do is set this equal to what's called a function. And this is the keyword function, which is basically just a block which contains a set of operations. So if we wanted to, this operation could be to resize our composition. It could be a long series of operations. And then we have to say parentheses after our function, and we put everything inside of our function inside of these curly braces. So we have our button 1 that we refer to. Whenever we click on it, we want to run this code here. If you want, you can just copy and paste this bit and reuse it all you want, but we're basically running what's called an anonymous function. Oftentimes we name functions special things like run operation or resize comp. In this case, it's anonymous, doesn't have a name, but all the code we put inside of here will run after we click on button 1. So if we want, we can do what's called an alert message. We can say alert, and the argument this takes, what goes inside of the parentheses, is a string with the text we want to appear on the alert message. So you could say, hello, you clicked button 1, and now when I click on button 1, I get a pop-up saying, hello, you clicked button 1. So that's how we know this is working. We get this alert message that says hello. When we click on this button 1, we know that this bit of code is actually working. We can copy and paste this and change the name to button 2 and say, hello, you clicked on button 2. So now we have an operation for button 1 and for button 2. Obviously, just making a pop-up happen isn't exactly what we want to do. So let's decide on some actual useful functions that each of these buttons can do to learn some of the in and outs of the scripting guide and doing actual scripting for After Effects, not just the UI portion of things. So if we click on button 1, let's do some operations to a composition and the layers inside of it. So firstly, let's define a new function. Right here we have a function which just exists on its own, but if you want to hard set a function and define one, we could say function, and now we need to say the name of the function. We could say modify layers, and you can see this type of casing that I used. The first word is all lowercase, and every word after that is uppercased for the first letter. So modify layers and comps, something like that, or you just say modify layers. Again, we need the parentheses and these curly braces to put everything inside of the function. So what we want to do is whenever we click on button 1, we want to run whatever code is inside of modify layers. So to do this, we need to say, instead of alert, you clicked button 1, we're going to call this function. Instead of defining it with the function keyword, we simply need to call the name of the function with parentheses, and end it with a semicolon. If you couldn't already tell by now, in JavaScript, you do need to end every line with a semicolon for the most part. If you couldn't tell by now, you do need to add semicolons to the ends of most lines here in JavaScript, but I kind of assumed that. So whenever we click on button 1, run the function called modify layers. You can see when I highlight it, it highlights both of them. That means this is going to go into this. And if we wanted to, we could add an alert inside of here to let us know we are inside of modify layers. So if I hit button 1, we are inside of modify layers. So let's modify a composition and some layers. How do we get the composition? Well, first off, we should have sort of a starting requirement for this script. Let's say the starting requirement is that the user already has a composition open and selected, and at least like a layer inside of it. What we could do is actually check if they have a composition open. So let's do that first. We're going to use what's called an if statement. We say if some kind of operation is true or some kind of mathematical value or comparison is true, run some code or don't run some code. So if I say if parentheses, this is what we want to analyze. If I want to say if 0 is equal to 0, that's true. So whatever we put inside of the curly braces after that, kind of like a function, is what it's going to run. Some code to run. So if this is true, which it is, this is going to run. We could say if 0 is less than 5, then run this code. We could say if the letter A is equal to the letter A, etc. There's lots of ways we can do this. And you can even compare different variable types. The reason I'm not using a single equals sign is because this is to set variables, as you might have noticed here. If we say 1, it's to set the variable. If we say 2 equals, it's to compare these after they've been converted to the same type. If you say 3, this, for example, will be much more strict, and this will still be true. But if I said something different, it might not be. The reason we use one equal sign, the reason we don't use one equal sign is because one equal sign sets the value of a variable. 2 is what we basically use to compare most of the time. So the thing we're going to check instead of some math, we're going to check if there's an active composition. So this is going to be our first bit of After Effects coding. We're going to say app, which refers to the application After Effects itself, dot project, which refers to the current open project. It doesn't have to be a saved project, it's just whatever's open in After Effects right now. And we're going to say dot active item. The active item is whatever's selected. If you had something selected over here, that might be the active item. If we have a comp selected right here, that's the active item. So we're going to check if the active item is equal to null. If the active item gives us something undefined, bad, null, 0, that is going to be triggered by this, which means alert, you have no comp or no composition selected. And then we're going to do what's called return false. What that does is it's going to leave this function. We don't want them to get anywhere past this function if they don't have a composition selected. So we can say if app.project active item is null, alert, you have no composition selected. Let's run it. Make sure we have nothing selected and run it. Now it knows we have no comp selected. If I select a composition, you can see nothing happens. We haven't programmed the case for that yet. There is maybe one more bit of logic we should add to this. We can add multiple statements in here to compare multiple things to see if they're true. So currently we're checking, is this equal to null? Is the active item null? We can also say or, which is 2 vertical lines like this. We can also say and, which is 2 ampersands. So we could say if there is no null object and 0 is equal to 0, or we could say if app.project.active item is equal to null or 0 is equal to 0. What we're going to say is or app.project.active item, same thing. We're going to check if it's an instance of, which checks the basically type of variable it is, a comp item. Now, a comp item is predefined in After Effects scripting to tell you what a composition is. So we're going to check if it's equal to null, if there's nothing active, and it's a composition. But we want to check if it's not a composition. So we can enclose this entire bit of logic in parentheses and put an exclamation mark in front of it to reverse it. So this now says is not a composition. So now we know they for sure have a composition. We can go past the if statement. if they don't have a composition selected, they're not getting past this bit of code. So they won't see all this down here if they don't have an active comp. Now let's create a variable to store that composition. We know we have one, so we'll say composition is equal to app.project.activeItem. If I wanted to, I could get the name of the composition, alert composition.name. You can see the name here matches up exactly. Now let's create a variable to store this layer here. So I'll say var layer. And how do we get the layer? Well, first we need to refer to a composition. We have one we just stored. And we can either say layer, the index of the layer, which is basically just displayed right here. This is the exact index. If we had, say, 6 layers, this would be layer index 6, layer index 1, 2, 3, etc. So we're going to say layer 1. Now we can say alert layer.name. You can see we now get the layer name, which includes this path here. Now we have the layer in a variable. If you just said layer, you would see that it's actually not like just the name. It is a AV layer object, which has lots of properties and things we can adjust. If you wanted to, you could start looking inside of the script. If you said, okay, I'm looking at an AV layer item or a layer item, we could go to layer object, and this will then tell us everything associated with the layers. We have autoorient.comment.containing composition, has video or not, the ID of the layer, the index, the endpoint, all these properties, and there's even more methods which would do things like add motion graphics templates and a whole bunch of other things. So what can we do useful with this layer? Let's go ahead and adjust, say, like the position and the scale. These guys right here. We can access these properties and even apply keyframes or change the values ourselves. So the way we do that, we're going to first change the position. So we'll say layer, and we want to get the property, and the property needs a string. We normally could just say position, get the property called position, but this won't work in every single language. I want to make sure this works in all languages, which makes it a little bit more complicated. In the first property, we need to say ADBE, short for Adobe, transform group. This means basically the actual transform group, which contains the opacity, scale, position, and all that. We first want to refer to this. And Adobe transform group with this text here is called the match name. This will work in any language and doesn't rely on your language meaning transform to mean actually transform in English. So we want to refer to the transform group and then the property inside of that called Adobe position. That's how we can reference the actual position. Then if you want, you could say .value, and if we surround this in parentheses, we could alert it. What's the position value? You can see it's 960, 540, and 0, XYZ. It's not a 3D layer, but it still contains the Z position. So we can read the value, we can also set the value. If I want to, I can say get rid of this alert, so we just have layer.transformGroup.position. Instead of .value, let's say .setValue. Now, because it's got multiple dimensions x and y, we need to give it an array to tell it x and y. Remember how we set our dropdown.size with x and y? We can do the same thing here. We just give it an array with an x and a y value for our position. Let's say 2000 by 2000. Now we can go ahead and run this, hit button 1, and now our layer is way gone, but that's because the position's been set to 2000 by 2000. So now our button is actually starting to do some functionality, which is super cool. Let's copy and paste this line of code and change Adobe position to Adobe scale. Scale also has an X and a Y. So we can set it instead of 2000 to maybe 200 by 200. Now, if we wanted to not do this position, we could delete it or we could comment it out, which means to just put 2 slashes before it. This means it's like a personal comment. This code will not run. So now we can run the scale operation, undo that, and run the scale operation, which will scale it up to 200%. So let's change this position algorithm to be 1000 by 1000 to be less harsh. Now what else can we do? If we wanted to, we could maybe copy and paste this one more time, change it to Adobe opacity, and instead of setting the value, let's set the expression. We'll say dot expression is equal to, in single quotes, we'll put in our expression. We'll just say wiggle 2, comma, or 3 comma 30. That's our expression within single quotes. When we run this, you can see if we just play it, our opacity is now wiggling because we have an expression applied to it. So that's the basics of accessing your layer, changing the position, scale, different properties, adding an expression to something. Now let's adjust the size of our composition. We'll say composition.width is equal to maybe 500. Then we can say composition.height is equal to 1000. We run this. You can see now our comp has been resized, Control K, to 500 by 1000, just as we defined. If you wanted to, we could also change the name of our composition by saying .name is equal to my renamed composition. Run this, and it will now rename our composition. So that's just a couple of ways you can change the properties, add expressions and things like that. And you can read all of the available things that you can access, change, of course, inside the scripting guide. So if we go to, we find comp item, we can check active camera, background color, counters, display start time, frame blending, the frame duration, the layers, the markers, the motion blur, so many things you can get access to. The last thing I want to do with this first button is to add an effect to our layer. So I'm going to create a variable to hold that effect, and I'm just going to call this my effect. We're going to set this equal to my layer, and we're going to say .effects, capital, and we're going to say .add property. We're going to add a property, and the name of this property needs to be the match name of the effect. Say I wanted to add an exposure effect. The name of the effect is exposure, but the match name is Adobe Exposure 2. I know this will work because when I click on button 1 and look at my layer, I now have an exposure effect applied. Let's go ahead and change the exposure value itself. Similar to how we access this layer, we said layer index 1. We can also do the same with properties. In this case, it looks like the exposure property in the exposure effect is property 1, 2, 3. To check this, I could simply say alert my effect dot property 3, and we want to know what the name of property 3 is. So we can alert, it says exposure, which is the name of that property. Perfect. And you can see we have to undo this a bunch now. One thing we can do to avoid this is surround all the code we want to undo in one click with a bit of code. Watch this. You can say app.begin undo group, and then in the parentheses we'll give it a name. We'll just call my process, and this will appear in edit undo, and we can undo a specific custom name or set of operations here. And then at the end of all of our code we can say app.end undo group, and this will basically allow us to undo everything in one click. So if I set my comp back to its original state, run the script, and hit button 1, you can see we've done a bunch of operations. We've added an effect, we've resized stuff, but if I hit Control Z now, it goes back to the very beginning. So we can undo a whole bunch of things with this one operation or one undo click. Lastly, let's change the value of this exposure effect. We found out it was property number 3, so my effect.property 3, and we're going to set the value. Same way we set the value of our scale, we're going to set the value of our exposure, which is only one value. It doesn't have an X and a Y, so let's set it to 2. We'll run this, apply, and now it's increased our exposure value to 2. And of course, you could also do expressions or whatever you want to all of these properties, the same we did up here. All right, to finish off the learning section of this tutorial, the coding section, we're going to add some functionality to button number 2 here. Specifically, let's learn how to import a file from our computer and then add that into the timeline. So we have our code here, it says alert, you click button 2. What's our function going to be named here? We'll just say import and add. Not the best name, but we're going to import it to the project and then add it to a layer. So we will then define this function, import and add. Now let's first create an object that represents a file. The way we do that is just by creating a variable. I'll say my video file, and we're going to set this equal to a file, and then in parentheses is the path to this file itself. In my videos folder, I have a video file called test. So the way we can reference any of our folders, we can say videos with this tilde here, dash videos, or if you're on Mac, that's dash movies, or you can say documents, photos, videos, downloads. Downloads is a very common one. But in this case, I want to get my videos, and it's called test.mp4. One thing we can do to make sure this file, that we put all this code in correctly and it exists and it's going to work if we try and import it, we can say alert my video file dot exists. Exists will tell us true or false whether this file exists. In this case, true, it does exist. So now that we know it exists, let's import it. When we import something, it's going to return us with an object, which means it's going to store it in a variable. We can say video item. This is going to represent the video once we've imported it over here. It's going to represent this item here. So we're going to say video item is equal to app.project, our current After Effects project, dot import file. Now inside the parentheses of import file, we need to first create what's called an import options group. So we need to say new space import options, and in another set of parentheses, we're going to give it our file. If you want to look at this more specifically in the guide, just type in .import file. And if you go through a couple, you can see an example code. This is exactly what we're doing here. app.project.import file, a new import options, which usually lets you define things like import as a sequence, alphabetically, and all that kind of stuff. In this case, it doesn't really matter. And in this case, it provides a new file, but we already have a file defined, so we just put it in here. So if I run this, hit button 2, you can see test.mp4 is imported into my project. Now, how do we add this into our composition? We're simply going to reference our composition, app.project.activeItem.layers. We're going to reference all the layers inside of it, and we're going to say add. What are we going to add in the parentheses? Our video item that we just imported. So when I run this, it will import our file, and if we have a composition selected, add it inside of the composition. If you don't have a comp selected, like this, it won't add it, but it will import it. Now, one last thing I'll go ahead and go over is looping to do a bunch of operations at once. If I wanted to add this layer like 100 times, I could do that with one simple operation. We simply say for, this is called a for loop, and then we surround our operation we want to do many times in these brackets. Inside the parentheses, we're going to create a temporary variable called I, set this equal to 0. Then we'll say I is less than maybe 100. Then we say I++. This is a very common way of looping through things in JavaScript for complete beginners out there who don't know what a for loop is. Basically, we define a temporary variable, and we're going to go one at a time, I++, from 0 to 100, which will run this operation basically 100 times. So if I do run this, it should import once and then add the layer 100 times to my composition. As you can see, it's taking just a second, but in just, I don't know, 3 seconds, we added 100 layers, and just think of how many other automatic operations you could then apply to so many different layers. And that's pretty much it for the basic coding part of this tutorial. The last thing I wanted to talk about was a little bit about like what's next if you're just beginning programming or you want to take the next steps to really start learning and getting involved in scripting. Although I didn't do it a whole lot in this tutorial, consult the guide very often because it is your best friend. As soon as you start to sort of understand the language this is written in, how you can quickly navigate it, and learn all of the supported things and how to get to different parts of After Effects with scripting, then it becomes very powerful and you can learn a ton in a short period of time. You can also watch more videos. I have playlists on my channel with hundreds of scripting videos, quick tips, and long form videos of how to do specific things, how to fix specific bugs, specific features, full projects, coding challenges. You can also join the Discord where lots of people help, and we are continually learning from each other things all the time and recommending new things to try. Now, if you're wanting to keep learning scripting but you're not sure how, pick a goal or a cool project idea you have and do what it takes to learn each little step along the way to accomplish that. For example, if you wanted to learn how to create a slideshow generator, Well, what do you need to do? First, you need to learn how to import the images to After Effects. Then you need to learn how to create a composition with the right sizes, the right length. Then I need to learn how to add the audio, maybe adjust the volume, change the properties, etc. And you learn each step along the way. Each little feature will start to add up until you fully understand the language. But that's going to do it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, hit the thumbs up button. Down below, hit subscribe and the bell icon to be notified of new videos coming out twice weekly in the channel. And down in the description, you can check out this code in the GitHub link. Try it out for yourself and make modifications and keep your learning journey going. Make sure you follow us there for coding updates. And in the description, follow us on Instagram for other live updates. If you're not already a member of our Discord server, you can come and join to help with scripting, extensions, plugins, submit tutorial ideas, and much more. And if you'd like to help support us on YouTube, you can become a member, supporter, premium supporter, or VIP. It comes with cool perks, Discord status, VIP tutorials, code in advance. You can also check us out on Adobe Exchange and AE Scripts to help us help support us and check out some cool products there as well. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.